assistance referring to China more than our foreign aid. He said three things. He says that for countries that receive Chinese development assistance, they are able to build their capacity for self-development. That is one. And in contrast, the argument is development assistance from Western countries results in dependence. Whereas for China, if you receive Chinese development assistance, there is enhancement of your capacity towards self-development. He then says there will be enrichment and improvement of livelihoods of recipient countries. And the third one, the Chinese Development Cooperation, Chinese Development Partnership promotes economic growth and social progress. So three things: self-development capacity, enrichment and improvement of livelihoods, and promotion of economic growth and social progress for recipients of Chinese development assistance. So that's what it seeks to achieve for countries that receive the aid. But what values underpin those things, and how is it aiming to achieve that? China emphasizes on the values of equality and mutual benefit. And mutual benefit, I will explain it a little bit later, but it emphasizes on equality and mutual benefit and contrasts that with the recipient-donor kind of relationship, north-south kind of asymmetries that underpin Western foreign aid, where objectives, where timelines, where milestones, outcomes are set in the capitals. If it is DFID, they're set in the UK, in London. If it is USA, they were set in Washington, and then kind of like imposed on recipient countries. So China talks about equality and mutual development as underpinning values, underpinning its development cooperation with African countries and indeed other countries. And the most important thing, which resonates with many African countries, is that China's aid comes with no political conditions attached. Now, we can talk about no political conditions in terms of the fact that China doesn't say you need to change your regime, you need to change your human rights approach and things like that, as those conditions that it is talking about. Yes, from that perspective, Chinese development cooperation doesn't come with those political conditions attached. But it has other conditions that are attached. For instance, when I started off, I said all the other African countries were represented at the FOCAC in 2024 in Beijing, with exception of Eswatini. Eswatini was not accepted or was not able to come because it recognizes Taiwan. It has diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and that's a condition that is given by China. China, its foreign aid, there is economic conditions that are attached. When China provides aid, it is mostly a certain percentage of materials that are used. If it is a construction project, it comes from China, and in most cases, the construction is done by a Chinese company. So it has economic conditions and not necessarily the political conditions in terms of aid and regime time. And then the third principle that China emphasizes is on substantial results. And this is an argument that Museveni also made. The Chinese aid has sustainable and substantial results that everyone can see. You can see the road. If you go to Zimbabwe, you can see the parliament, you can see the clinic, you can see all those things. In contrast, Western aid, it can be difficult to see the product, the result. At least that's the argument that China gives and some political leaders in Africa gives. That it's very difficult to see the soft results of better governance, transparency, accountability, and things like that, which is usually what our Western aid has been kind of like supporting. So it emphasizes three things, those three values: equality and mutual benefit from political conditions attached, and stressing on substantial results. But in all this, you get a picture of an altruistic, benevolent China that is providing aid for the benefit of African countries or its recipients. And the argument we make throughout this book, that there is no difference in the objectives that China seeks to achieve for its own objectives and what the United States also seeks to achieve. And there are four things that China mentions in its white paper that says it wants to achieve for itself. So I've talked about what the recipient countries will get, the values that underpin it, and they resonate with African recipients of Chinese aid. China says that by providing this development assistance or development cooperation to African countries and to other countries in the global south, it seeks to build friendly relations. And we see the value of these friendly relations. I don't know if you remember a few years back when there was an issue about the Uyghur Muslims and how they were treated by China. Several European countries wrote a letter to the UN Human Rights Council protesting and complaining about China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims. And a number of African countries and many countries from the global south, wrote a letter supporting China's approach to dealing with the issues regarding the Uyghur Muslims. So these are the friendly relations that China is talking about, right? I scratch your back, we scratch my back. I do not attach conditions to the aid that I provide, therefore we provide a friendly relations. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Chinese aid is meant to enhance or to strengthen economic and trade relations. So that also talks about the nature of aid that China provides, right? I'll talk about that in a few moments. So keep that point in mind. Strong economic and trade relations. And the third one is to promote South-South cooperation. And also the fourth one is common development for all mankind. How does it do this? And this is the kind of aid that I'm going to talk about in China provides. So by shifting in 2021 from talking previously about foreign aid, technical assistance, technical cooperation, assistance, to talking about international development cooperation and partnership, what China did was to incorporate aid as one of the elements of the international development cooperation. So its international development cooperation has three elements, what some authors have called the Trinity concept. It's not a Chinese invention. The Japanese were doing this in the 1960s or so. So the Trinity concept combines aid, trade, and investment. So when you combine those three, the aid ceases being aid in the way that the OECD countries define aid. Aid becomes pretty much more broader than normal foreign aid. So it encompasses aid, trade, and investment. And what incorporates that? Belt and Road Initiative is a perfect example of how China combines all those three elements in such a way that it is very difficult, even for recipient countries, to determine which aspect is aid, which aspect is trade, which aspect is investment. How do you define those things? I'll give you an example. It must be in 2017 or so. The Zimbabwean government in its budget, it announced the aid that it had received from different countries, right? And when it announced the aid it received from China, it was a very small amount, something like 300,000 US dollars or so. It was using the strict OECD definition of foreign aid. Right? And the Chinese embassy protested heavily, and it even wrote those things on Twitter, complaining that the Zimbabwean government had understated the aid that China had provided to the Zimbabwean government. After a lot of consultation, the Zimbabwean government revised the figure because the Chinese government mentioned several things. It says when it is talking about aid, when it is talking about development cooperation, it includes the rice, materials that it has provided. It includes money, it includes grants, it includes some of the trade and investments that incorporate elements of grants as well, elements of our aid. So you can see the picture there is that it becomes a little bit more complicated for even recipient countries to determine which aspect of the cooperation they're getting from through China is aid, which aspect can be trade, or which aspect is investment, or which it becomes really difficult. And some have argued that when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it resembles that complexity of not being able to pinpoint what exactly is a Belt and Road Initiative project and what is not, right? So that vagueness provides China with the veneer that it needs to define cooperation broadly and to encompass as many things as it possibly can. In all this, what China then shows is that its development cooperation is much more expansive than the Western end. And what is the agenda in defining it so broad? These are three things that I want to point out to, and I will then explain the continuities, that it is not something that we are just seeing today. It's something that has been happening even in the past when China started to engage African countries. The first thing is that China seeks to enhance its legitimacy as a global leader. First, as a global leader of the global south or developing countries. So legitimacy is that global. The second one is to reform the international system to suit China's needs and science interest. And the third one, so interest, values, and the third one is to support China's understanding of China's own development and governance model. And thirdly, to share the domestic politics of recipients. So the first one, legitimacy as a global leader. In the 19th, China started providing aid to African countries, I think around 1956. At that time, China was much poorer in terms of GDP per capita compared to some of the countries that were receiving its aid, Ghana, for instance. But the question is, why is China providing aid to countries that are better off than itself? What China wanted to do at that point was to portray the image that China is a global leader, that it is willing to make sacrifices, and that a major power makes sacrifices on behalf of other powers. And that enhanced the legitimacy of China. When we look at all our countries, they pretty much African countries in that respect. When they talk about their engagement with China, it begins from China making sacrifices, and those sacrifices in providing aid, even when it actually needed that aid. So, what was the objective? On 8 August 1963, Chairman Mao made this statement, and he says, he was talking to African leaders. He says, our unity is not one of race. It is the unity of comrades and friends. We should strengthen our unity and wage a common struggle against imperialism, colonialism, and their lackeys, and for complete and thorough national independence and liberation. And in making that statement, he also made an argument, which he had made a couple of years earlier when he was supporting when he was providing support to North Korea. The way people within the government was complaining, why are we giving aid to North Korea when we actually need the money ourselves, aiding other people when China is in desperate need for those funds. Chairman Mao makes this argument, and he talks about what he calls maximum benevolence. And in maximum benevolence, he defined it as you give not out of surplus, but out of necessity in some way. You give because of sacrifice, not because you have plenty. And that's an argument that China has constantly made, that in providing its aid to African countries, it is not because China is a developed nation, it still wants to view itself as a developing country. And that allows it to link its own struggles with the struggles of African countries, like Chairman Mao was making that statement. Fast forward in 2024 at the FOCAC summit, President Xi makes a similar argument. And in his argument, he links the context, the global context in which the US is trying to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, dominate other countries. And he makes an argument that China has a similar struggle with African countries, and that struggle is to develop independently without interference from other parties. So whereas Chairman Mao was talking about political independence, President Xi is talking about economic independence at your own terms. And with that economic independence comes with the ability and power to define your own foreign policy objectives. So that's the first thing. And you can see how that has been consistent right from the 1950s up to today. The second aspect is that whereas Mao was providing aid to Africans, particularly liberation war movements and some governments, and the idea, the long-term objective, was that these countries would be able to support China in its own struggles with the Soviet Union and its own struggles as well for global influence with the United States. At the core of that struggle was the struggle to define what the international system should look like, the values that it should represent, and the interests that it should represent. And that if I track, this is exactly the same thing that Chairman Mao is, that President Xi is also talking about, right? And he makes an argument in I think it must be in 2021 at the United Nations. He makes an argument to say, in this struggle for development, China has answered the call and has built the consensus to provide development for other countries to learn from China's experience. So we see a China that seeks to provide an alternative perspective, an alternative approach to development, and obviously, like I started at the beginning, to modernization. And it talks about it as an enabler. How then should China do that? So the United States are quite clear on how it does it. When it is providing aid, it has linked its foreign aid, right, even from the 1960s, linking its foreign aid with how countries vote at the United Nations, with countries, do countries align with its values? Does it propel its values? And what Donald Trump is simply doing is to reassert that position, that aid will only be provided when it ensures that the United States achieves its objectives. Now, that comes with sanctions being enforced, that comes with all sorts of measures, including also military action being taken to force out regimes that may not be aligned with US interests. For China, it's a different route, right? That it is not necessarily imposing sanctions or withdrawing aid from these countries to force them to change, but it is to some extent linking its aid much more broadly with many other development projects. And in doing that, sending a message in some way that it is not going to force countries to align with its values. It is leaving African countries to determine how they want to engage. And for that, I'm going to explain a few things, two things that I want to explain. The first thing is that whereas the United States and Western countries talk in terms of allies and alignment, China talks about partnership, development cooperation, development partnership. It talks about African countries as partners. It talks about comprehensive strategic partnerships. It talks about partnership more than it doesn't talk about alignment. The reason why it doesn't talk about alignment is that President Xi talks about the Cold War mentality. You have to align with a particular country. And you go back to Mao's times when there was a fallout with the Soviet Union, China said it was going to seek an independent foreign policy. So it will not align with the Soviet Union, neither will it align with the United States. So there is continuity there in this argument that they seek partnership, not alignment. What is the significance? The significance is that when you align, you are stuck with the power that you're aligned to, right? everything needs to be aligned to the global power that you have aligned. And that leaves countries without room to maneuver, without room to determine the relationship that they want to have and the scope and the extent of that relationship. But when you're talking about partnerships, it projects this image of mutual equality, beneficial, mutually beneficial equality. We are equal partners. And therefore, you determine the nature of the partnership, the objectives of the partnership, and the scope of that partnership. And let me give you this example. In June 2024, the United States hosted, Biden hosted William Ruto, and he announced that they had seen the memorandum designation of Kenya as a major non-NATO ally. What it meant, right? The critics of this alignment, that Kenya is now a major non-NATO ally, whatever that meant, was that Kenya was to some extent becoming a vassal power of the United States, doing the bidding for the United States. And in September 2024, just a couple of months later, the Chinese government at FOCAC announced that it was elevating relations with Kenya to comprehensive strategic partnership. And you can see here the message being sent is partnership has more value than alignment. And William Ruto, I think he will be going to Kenya. He will be going to Beijing, I think, this week also. For many countries, we have coming up, for many countries in the global south, they have seen the disadvantages of being aligned. Two things that happened. In 2022, right at the peak of the Russian-Ukrainian war, several senators in the US tried to sponsor a bill which they called Countering Malign Russia Activities in Africa. And the whole idea was to punish African countries that align with Russia or that seem to be supporting Russia's position. So African countries are being forced to choose an ally, right? Either you align with Russia or you align with the US and other Western powers. And this is what the Chinese president is saying, the Cold War mentality, that African countries are being pushed to align with. So that was the first one. In 2024, right, South Africa takes Israel to court, tries to be independent in its foreign policy. And the US signed a bill which is called the US South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act of 2024. And the whole purpose of that was for the President of the United States to continuously review if its engagement with South Africa is still, if South Africa is still aligned with the US interest. So you can see that what Chinese foreign aid is seeking to do is to show that side of Western aid and to try to say we are different, right? Where you are told to align, we seek partnership. So we are equal partners in this relationship. The consistent values, I've talked about the consistent values. And the third thing which I've talked about when I was comparing what Mao said and what Xi Jinping said is the internationalist duty. That China has a duty to support developing countries to achieve political independence during Mao's time, and then in Xi Jinping's time to achieve economic development at their own terms. The consistency of the values, the partnership, not alignment. And how is this shaping out? How does it do it? In the book, we talk about something we term scavenger diplomacy, is looking at countries that have very bad relations with Western countries that are on sanctions and providing development cooperation to those countries. Zimbabwe is a very good example. Sudan was a very good example of those cases. So in looking at those stuff, and it's not something that just started off now in China, but it's also something that started off even during Mao's time. At the height of the Suez Canal, China supported, provided a lot, a grant to Egypt of 5 million US dollars, small amount there. But the whole purpose of that aid was to send a message to Egypt that we stand with you. So aid ceases just being to support development. It is a solidarity message for those countries that are being ostracized by Western donors. Now, when you look at all that, you can see that Chinese aid is not just altruistic, it's not just benevolence from China, but it has major strategic objectives for China that it seeks to achieve. But one of those, and I'm finishing off now, one of those is to shape the domestic and foreign politics or policies of recipient countries. Many people would say, and at some point I've said, China doesn't seek to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. But there are subtle ways that it can do that. Now, finishing off with two examples. The first example which I want to give is that in the 1960s, when Nasri was fighting against communist parties in Egypt and communist parties in Syria as well, the Chinese government allowed the Chinese media to write very critical papers, very critical articles, very critical articles against the Egyptian government. And the whole purpose of doing that, whereas the aid that it had provided initially was to say, we stand with you. The second one is to say, if you dare go against us, if you go this direction, we will fight against you. And recently, the Chinese government has made a similar announcement that for countries that give in to US tariffs against Chinese interests, and that works against Chinese interests, then China will take some action, whatever that action is. But fast forward, in Zimbabwe recently, and there is quite a number of stuff that has been done of this. I think Obed Bore has written about this as well. And the argument is that the Chinese government started sending or directly responding to civil society organizations, to journalists, to opposition political leaders that says things that jeopardize or that change the image of China in Zimbabwe. So direct, communication with China, with Zimbabwe citizens and Zimbabwean organizations. On China's strict definition of non-intervention, this is direct interference in the internal affairs of Zimbabwe. So that's one element. So directly dealing with critical voices of China in recipient countries. The second one is where China, or rather the third one, is where Chinese aid, unlike aid from Western countries, the recipients of Chinese development cooperation are governments. It doesn't provide aid to civil society organizations, does not provide aid to other entities, non-state actors. In doing that, what China simply does is to aid those regimes, and even in cases where they would likely crumble because of lack of resources, when China provides them with the aid, it provides them with the legitimacy. It provides them with the resources that they actually need to continue going. And the Zimbabwean case is one of those examples. So finishing off, the argument that we make in this book is to say US aid and Chinese aid, they both seek to achieve four things. So rather, four things. Maintain the international system as it is to serve its own interest. In the case of the United States, and in the case of China, seek to reform the international system. The second one is to enhance their legitimacy as global leaders. And the third one is to shape the domestic politics of our recipient states. So perhaps let me end here. I think I've talked for a long time. Let me end here, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions and to elaborate on any of the points that I've missed.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that insightful talk and presentation. And I think it's quite timely. I mean, given the geopolitical dynamics that we are seeing happening, especially in the last few months. And yeah, I think there are quite a number of implications of especially the orders by Donald Trump in cutting foreign aid in other countries, but also I think accelerated aid by China over the past few years. So I think it's quite timely and interesting. So let me open up to colleagues if there are any questions, any comments on the presentation. I would be happy to open, and then I think maybe we can take about 3-4 questions, and then we take the other questions after that. Yes, we have opened it up. Yes, I see Godfrey. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Odzi, for the presentation on China aid and
you're muted, Godfrey. Unfortunately,
okay.
you got muted. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for that. So thank you very much, Professor Odzi, for the presentation. So I wanted to find out in terms of theorizing aid, particularly in Africa, what does Chinese aid do to our theorization of aid, particularly in Africa? So I'm asking at a very abstract and theoretical level in terms of the social theory on aid in Africa. What does Chinese aid do to our understanding of social theory on aid in Africa? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I think we can take 2 or 3 more questions before we allow Orbit to respond to those questions. Maybe as we are waiting, I would be happy to also abuse my power as the chair to throw in one quick one and maybe give colleagues the opportunity to prepare their questions. Okay, I see Edwin. Let me come after Edwin. Go ahead, Doc. Edwin. You're still muted. Edwin, are you there? Okay, I'm sure we will be able to take your question. Yeah, I wanted to throw in the question on China's strategy of non-intervention, especially when it comes to foreign aid and respect for sovereignty of the countries that it works with as partners, as development partners. And I wanted to pick your brain with regards to that, because I think that has been one of the key criticisms with Chinese aid in many countries, that sometimes they provide military assistance and then reinforcing sort of political authoritarianism in I think some of the countries that you've highlighted, Zimbabwe, for instance, Uganda. I mean, I could go on and on mentioning some of these African and non-African countries. So I think I'll just throw in that one and maybe come with other questions later. Edwin, I don't know if you are able to speak now, and other colleagues who might have any questions on the presentation on Chinese foreign aid. Edwin? Okay, yes, Talent, go ahead. You can unmute your mic and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gukurume. Thank you, Professor Odzi, for this eye-opening presentation regarding the the foreign aid that Africa receives from these superpowers. My question is on the, I think what the point that you have driven home is that there's a clear agenda behind the advancement of the supposed aid that comes to Africa by these superpowers. My question is, what is the connection then between the aid that a country like Zimbabwe receives, for example, and then the behaviors or the tendencies of Chinese nationals that then visit these countries to set up businesses, particularly in the extractive sectors like mining. We can all see that a lot of activities do happen in some of these mining places. The damage to the environment, the non-regard to the laws of the land, the killing of workers in some of these places and so forth. Is there any connection between the aid that we receive and the the non-compliance of or the soft stance that the government would probably have on these Chinese nationals that then come home and set up shop in countries like Zimbabwe?
Okay. Yeah, I see Edwin put the question in the comment section. He's saying I cannot unmute on my side, but my question is, how far is China's aid without strings? Is there any free lunch? So I think he's basically talking about the conditionalities that comes with Chinese aid, and maybe the implications of such conditionalities. Maybe the last one before we give Prof. Obed to respond. I think Simba, I saw your hand. You can go ahead, and then we'll take the second round after you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kukurume and Prof. Hozi. I think it's one of the few instances where I have had China being painted in a very well respected way. But I think at the end of it, you showed us the subtle agenda of China. And my question now is, in comparison to the Western aid, because I do believe for Singapore, for Germany, and many other countries during the World War II, they also received aid. But you could then see within a period of 2 decades, the speed of those countries in regards to development and sustainability on themselves. However, you were pointing out in regards to partnership as China's mantra in approaching the Africans. But since you pointed that they have been doing the aid for quite a while, what are the substantial gains that any country, for instance, Zimbabwe, has to show? Because having had China aiding us for that long, what do we have as a nation to show that this is the China footprint? For instance, I'll give you, for Zimbabwe, you can say when Britons colonized us, we still have tarred roads that have sustained decades. We still have amazing infrastructure that has sustained decades. So in regards to the aid, specific aid of China, what do we have to show as African countries? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think, Obed, let me give you the opportunity to respond to that. I'm sure there are more questions in the chat and coming the second round as well.
Thank you very much. So let me start with what does it do for theorizing aid? What most of the theories that we can talk about realism, constructivism. I'm not a sociologist, so excuse me, I will not be able to comment on sociology theories and stuff like that. But we're writing this from an international relations kind of perspective. And what we thought is that when you look at how China conducts itself, many of the Western theories or the traditional theories that we know cannot really explain how China functions in terms of its aid, how China functions in terms of its governance system and how it relates with other countries. Take realism, for instance, right? Power, right, is critical. Power is important. Power, when a state grows economically powerful, it grows its military, and then it dominates other countries. And that expression of dominance, which we cover in this book, can be clearly seen from a Western perspective when you look at the United States, which clearly follows that kind of line of thinking. You have immense economic power, you develop your military capacity, and then you can exercise hegemony over other states. China says it doesn't follow that. One example that what can show us how that works is when Donald Trump started talking about the tariffs and announcing tariffs and all, there were maps that were being shown of African countries, with the exception of maybe one or two countries. The majority of African countries, their biggest trading partner is China. How did that happen? Why? How did that happen with no condition, political conditions, strict political conditions being attached? How did China become a major trading partner of these African countries? How has China become, here in the UK, they were talking about Chinese owners of the British steel, right? And how the government scrambled to try to nationalize it and take it over from the Chinese. How did that happen? How has BYD overtaken, the Tesla in Europe, in terms of sales, things like that? When you want to explain that using the traditional Western theories that we're kind of like accustomed to, you grapple to explain China and how it is rose to the position of dominance that it was in. And so what we thought we could do was to combine a number of theoretical approaches and perspectives for development, international relations, economics, comparative politics, comparative contemporary history as well. Is to show how the material and ideational factors in foreign aid cannot be truly explained using a single traditional IR theory from our perspective. So it's a combination of different themes. And because we're trying to explain it from a broad range of theories, it's difficult to underpin one main theory. But the point that we make at the end is what we call social legitimacy and reputation, is the combining concept that explains what China is trying to do, but also explains what the United States is trying to do with its foreign aid, or has been trying to do with its foreign aid, and how you can see the shift in EU, for instance, when they're talking about foreign aid and development cooperation, that they're talking much more now about cooperation, about partnership, more than they're talking about aid. Right, so you can see how China is shaping those, but we can only truly understand it if we take a step back and try to understand the world from a Chinese perspective. And the Chinese perspective is not a linear one. Economic power, military power to take over, right? It's much more complex than that. That's the answer I would perhaps give to that. What is the connection between aid that Zimbabwe receives and the tenets of Chinese nationals in behaving anyhow? Um, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one because of that Trinity concept that I talked about, where you have aid combined with trade, combined with investment. Right? When China is making investments, is it an investment? Is what exactly is it? It's difficult to tell. I think there were many concerns in the Zimbabwean case when that parliament was built, right? And it was handed over to the Zimbabwean government. Is it a grant? Is it a donation? Is it aid? What exactly is it? What has the Zimbabwean government given in exchange? And you can ask a lot of questions about many things that China has done in many different countries. Because of that complexity of not being able to pinpoint, is it aid, is it investment, what exactly is it a loan, right? It makes it very difficult, and that combines with the secrecy around the engagement that China has with African countries. That makes it very difficult for even our governments, and I say our, but African governments, for our African governments to know how to treat certain Chinese nationals. Because there is a perception that Chinese nationals operating in African countries are to some extent supported by the Chinese government, which is not true. All right. So that makes it very difficult for them to be published. Two things that I want to mention. McKinsey did a research some time back, it's a long time back now, maybe 2017 or so, in which they were making an argument that the number of Chinese businesses operating in Africa, the majority of them, about 90% of the Chinese actors, they are private actors, and about a third or so of them, the Chinese government is not even aware that they're existing in the African countries where they're operating. And the national and the authorities of the countries where they're operating are not even aware that they're operating. So you can see the complexity there, that even though there is a perception that these Chinese nationals represent the Chinese government or are doing the bidding for the Chinese government or represent the Chinese government in one way or another, the Chinese government doesn't know that a third of them actually exist. And in some cases, 2/3 of them, that they actually exist in the African countries where they do. So that then creates those confusions on how to treat these Chinese nationals when something bad happens. So there's a fear. And that's the power that China has to instill that fear in African governments such that they are fearful on how to treat Chinese nationals who break their own laws. China has tried to establish laws to govern how Chinese nationals behave abroad, and it usually makes a statement something along the lines that Chinese nationals are bound by the laws of the country where they're operating in, and that those countries will take their law, they'll be treated, if they break the law, they'll be treated according to the laws of that country. But it doesn't always work that way. And we know Chinese nationals who have been are given very lenient sentences or their cases just don't go anywhere. But that also speaks about the nature of governments that we have, right? That are not independent, that are not able to exercise independence, and also speaks about our judiciary systems, our criminal justice system, that it is not independent, that executive has and interferes in those issues. One example that perhaps makes it even more complicated is, I don't know if you guys remember some years back, when the Zimbabwean government was trying to nationalize all the diamond companies, the Chinese government protested because the Zimbabwean government was trying to nationalize one of the Chinese companies. And the argument was that there was an agreement that was made between the Zimbabwean government and Chinese actors that if there is any dispute regarding that arrangement that they had, that it will be dealt with diplomatically, not through the courts or any other means. Right. So you can see that there are many other things that are done or that are agreed upon that if there's a dispute with the Chinese company, it has to be dealt with in this particular way. So that really disempowers our governments on how they can deal with these Chinese nationals. this other thing is that many of the other Chinese companies that are operating, particularly in the extractive industry, depending on the African country that we're talking about, some of them are there as they're kind of like working with elites in those African countries. Cameroon is a very good example where the elites, they have the mining rights and they don't have the capital. So they invite a Chinese company or a Chinese nationals who have the capacity to do so. So they are basically doing the mining for them. So on paper, it's a Cameroonian national, a Cameroonian company that is doing the extraction, but when you go on the ground, it's actually a Chinese company doing that. So that adds again to the complexity on how these Chinese nationals are treated. There's no cheap lives, there's no aid without conditions, definitely not. And Chinese aid comes with conditions attached. The economic conditions that if it is Chinese aid, a certain percentage of resources that are used should be acquired from China, should be supplied by a Chinese company. And if it is a construction project, it should be done by a Chinese company. So those are conditions that are attached. But you also have other subtle means that China uses to force conditions. Is all about forcing the other person to do what they would otherwise not do, right? Do this or else this is going to happen. In South Africa, I think you might remember on 2 occasions or 3 occasions, they tried to invite the Dalai Lama, right? And the South African government refused a visa because China had protested and said, you are now interfering in our internal affairs if you give the Dalai Lama a visa to come to South Africa. Now that's interference that is happening there. That's a condition being set, and everyone kind of like knows from Norway to France to many different countries, they know if you do something that offends China, there will be penalties attached to it. And it could be very simple things, like for countries like South Korea, for instance, China simply prohibits tourism, Chinese tour groups to go to South Korea and deprive the tourism industry of these Chinese tourists who spend much more, who those tourism industries depend on. So it has much more power that it exercises and it uses to force certain countries to do what it wants them to do, or not to take any action at all if it involves something that they think China is going to be offended with. And the last one is in comparison to Western aid, what do we have that China has given us? I wouldn't talk about colonialism because colonialism was a totally different thing. Let's talk about aid from the time these African countries became independent. What was aid meant to achieve, and did it achieve those objectives that it was meant to achieve? In the hospital, not hospital, in healthcare and all that stuff, we all can see the results, right? They have supported hospitals, they've supported our health facilities, they have supported schools and many others. But the true mark of, if we want to say, has aid helped us, is do we remain dependent on that aid, or we build our capacity to be able to do those things without the aid that has been provided for us. Now we know in many parts of the world, when the US aid was withdrawn, many countries realized that they were really dependent on aid for decades, right? And that's the power that perhaps aid has. If you are just dependent on the aid that you receive, that it doesn't build your capacity to be able to do those things on your own. And that's the criticism that I have for aid. And on that, I kind of like agree with them somewhere in here argument about debt aid, that aid will not result in countries becoming rich. One argument that we make in the conclusion chapter of our book is that when you look at African countries, the amount of money that they lose, I think it's about 85 billion every year, that they lose because multinationals, particularly from Western countries, are not paying their taxes as they should is much more than the aid that African countries received, which was 55 billion US dollars, I think, in the last year or so. So you can see, right? But what makes our countries dependent on aid? The argument that I would make is that aid subsidizes our governments. Instead of them providing money for education, for health, for whatever, and you know, all these services that aid is doing, they channel the money towards something else, defense and many other things that do not really provide the development that people need. And when they do that knowing very well that if there's a health crisis, if there's an education crisis, aid is going to cover that gap. So aid, even from Western countries, actually subsidizes regimes that otherwise are kind of like do not do that for their citizens. So when we look at aid, I think we need to look at aid in independent Africa and not necessarily look at colonial Africa, because colonialism was a totally different thing. The argument that Museveni made, which I referred to, is what does Africa need today? Right. And by Africa, we can talk about the different Africas, right? We can talk about Africa from the perspective of political elites. We can talk about Africa from the perspective of normal people like you and me. Right? What do we need? We need healthcare. We need to walk less than 10 kilometers to the nearest school, to the next healthcare. Aid, Western aid does provide that, or it used to provide things like that. But you also have Chinese aid, which is providing things like hospitals, Mausepa hospitals, and China friendship hospitals in many different African countries. You have roads, you have all those things, infrastructure development, which African countries admit that they actually need, but Western governments are not willing to support. Now, is it aid, right, that is financing those things, or it is loans from China? That's where the complexity that I was talking about when I was talking about that Trinity concept, that it's loans, aid, trade, investment, all put in one basket, and then it becomes international development cooperation. And that makes it very difficult. So some of the things we may attribute to Chinese aid, it's not really aid, it's a loan that has been provided, or it's an investment that China is making. So, but in a nutshell, I would say the good thing perhaps with Chinese aid, if I can say that, is that the requests come from the African governments on what aid they want and where they want it. So Chinese aid is as good as your government is. If you have a useless, corrupt government, you will get useless stuff, like presidential policies and things like that. If you have a good, responsible government, you'll have hospitals, you'll have many other meaningful things. So Chinese aid is as good as your government is. I don't know if I've covered every question.
Thank you very much, Obed. I see there are some on the comments section as well, some few questions there. But I see Obakeng. Go ahead, Obakeng. You can throw in your question. And then I think there are some few questions that are also in the chat. We can't hear you, Obakeng. I can see you have unmuted yourself, but unfortunately we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me though?
Yes. We can hear you now.
Okay, no, I was saying thank you very much for the presentation, Prof. It's very insightful. I just want to pick the last comment that you made on the virtues of the Chinese aid, because saying that it's because of the governments that are making the request to China that they need certain amenities in their respective countries. I think it doesn't change the fact that it still creates a dependency on China, because China is the one that is, responsible for the maintenance and for the technologies that are associated with any infrastructure development in Africa. Still, Africa remains underdeveloped because the technical aspect of it and the capital aspect of it is wholly in the hands of the Chinese. And another thing that I think will assist us, I think, is the 1959 speech by Robert Sobukwe in his inaugural address when he was speaking to the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. He was dealing with this question of the Global South and the West being in a tussle with each other for world dominance. And Sobukwe referred to Kwame Nkrumah's work, neocolonialism, that rather Africa should be taking a position of positive neutrality in this tussle between these two hegemonies, the West and the Asians. I just want to pick up your brain on this one. That do you think that in this current climate, where China and America, they are in a tussle for world dominance or to assert themselves, do you think positive neutrality it's an advisable position to take? Our membership to BRICS and the other G20 and other formations. So those are my interesting thoughts. Or do we really have to take a positive neutrality in this climate of global activities between the West and the Asians? Yeah, those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Obakeng. I don't know, Obet, if you have seen a few comments. I think on in the chat there. I think there are a few that you might want to reflect on. Josiah has thrown in one, and then Teboho as well.
All right. So this question about positive neutrality, I think it's the luxury of powerful states that can afford to be independent. I think with the position that Africa is in today, it's very difficult for African countries to assert any neutrality in anything. And that's of our making, right? And one of the reasons is African countries are very dependent on charity from other countries, be it from China, be it from US and many other different countries, in such a way that when you are dependent on another power, if it withdraws the resources that it provides for you, then that forces you to change your position. Very, very simple things. I'll give you an example. Some years back, the Malawian government arrested 2 people who had officiated a same-sex marriage, right? And then they sentenced them to 14 years in prison. But Malawi forgot that it is dependent on aid from the UK. So the UK said they're withdrawing aid until they have done something about that. And an announcement was made that the guys had been released, presidential pardon, that they shouldn't do it again. And aid was restored. So you can see, can Malawi afford positive neutrality? No, it can't, right? We can see what South Africa is going through now, right, in trying to assert a position to say we want to be independent in our foreign policy. We will look at issues from our independent, from our own perspective, looking at Russia, looking at Israel, Gaza, and all that stuff. And we can see the backlash that has come and how South Africa is being treated. And with the way that South Africa is being treated today, which is the most advanced economy in Africa, and it's in BRICS, it's in G20 and all that stuff. It was hosting G20. The US said that it's not going to attend. What is South Africa going to do? And are there any African countries that have stood with South Africa? No, I'm not aware of any. What is the position that the African Union has taken regarding the way that South Africa is being treated by the United States. I'm not aware of any statement that the AU has made. I'm not aware of any statement that SADC has made. So as long as African countries can still be singled out and other countries just stand and watch, you are not going to have positive neutrality. It's not going to happen. So the positive neutrality depends on African countries being able to stand with each other and to make a unified voice. They have tried to do that, but on things that don't really matter, I think. When they were talking about the International Criminal Court is targeting African presidents, they tried to harness and stood together and said, well, I'm going to mass withdraw. But why haven't they done that on many other things that matter, right? So we can see how our African countries it's very difficult for them to take a position. The African Union, the majority of each budget comes from the EU. How are they going to be positive neutrality? They're not going to, right? So it makes it very difficult. The position that African countries are in economically, and its dependence on other powers makes it very difficult for them to exercise this positive neutrality. So I don't see it happening really. And what makes it even worse is that when it comes to countries that are challenged or punished by the United States, China, because of its partnership and non-alignment kind of approach, it doesn't come to the aid of those countries. It may pass statements like, oh, you know, we urge the parties to resolve the conflicts in a mutually beneficial way or something like that. But it never really takes a principled stance and says, this is our position. It hasn't done that with Russia. It hasn't done that with many other countries. Right? So you can see that African countries, they remain individual in their foreign policies, and that makes it very easy for them to be targeted and for them to change their positions because it comes to their survival. It'll be interesting to see what will happen with Rwanda, for instance, which is highly dependent on aid and has been cutting diplomatic ties with some European countries. So interesting to see what other African countries will say about it or what they have said about it. I'm not aware of anything that they have said. So that makes it difficult. Rwanda against the world, South Africa against the West. So you're just left on your own in some way. The other questions here is from Josiah. You say, could you comment if there are significant differences between China's treatment and assistance to African countries and its treatment to European countries such as Greece? Yes, there is. And like I said, with China, you get what you deserve. Or China is as good as your government is, right? If your government is not able to push a hard bargain, if your government is not sure of what they want, they will get the worst out of their engagement with China. And African countries, we can talk about Kenya, we can talk about Zimbabwe, Zambia, many different African countries. You can see that you only get what you're able to negotiate from them. And that makes it very difficult for African countries to get a good bargain from China. And the other thing is simply also because we do not negotiate with China as a bloc, we negotiate with China as single countries. And China promotes that bilateralism in its engagement with African countries. Look at a country like Zimbabwe with a GDP of 15 billion, negotiating with China with 15, 16 trillion. It doesn't make sense. South Africa, 350 billion. It doesn't make so much sense. And my hope is that perhaps with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, that if it comes and if it is implemented, that perhaps that give African countries a unified voice on how they can engage external powers, because it will be a bigger market. But as it is now, very few, not even South Africa, I think, can negotiate a hard bargain with China, because China is just too big for these African countries to engage with individually. So what form of globalization is China spearheading? China is the biggest beneficiary of globalization. So it doesn't really want to change so much. It wants, because it has benefited hugely from the way that the international economic system is set up. And what it's seeking is a voice that is commensurate with the power that it now has. And you can see that you can talk about globalization in economic terms, but you can also talk about other things that African countries actually want, like reforming the United Nations Security Council. And China doesn't support that. Its argument is that too many voices is going to make it much more difficult for there to be much more effective. So what China wants is to maintain the status quo as it is, but transforming it to meet China's needs, China's interests, and China's values. And those values are mutual benefit, right? And mutual benefit simply means that China gets the share of what it wants to get, based on its investment in this. So it wants an equal voice, a voice that is commensurate with the power that it now has and its share of the global economy, which for African countries, I think we have shrunk, if anything. We are the least developed regions in the world. So that makes it very difficult for us to speak the same language with China. The issue about enforcement of laws, the regulations in African countries is a huge challenge. So you have countries that may have very good laws on paper, but the implementation becomes enforcement of those laws is very difficult, right? So that makes it very difficult to determine what Chinese actors are doing, or even other actors are doing, Turkish actors, British actors, and all that stuff, what they're doing in those countries. So I think African countries, we need to develop our capacity and sometimes maybe harmonize our our economic laws and stuff like that. Because with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think if the idea is to create a common market, then we need to harmonize our laws and leverage on each other's strengths. But that's a long way coming, I think. Partnership, the challenge with partnership, and this in response to Simba, the challenge with partnership is partnership does not mean equality, right? You can be in a partnership, but only having a percentage, or the other one having 99%. It's still mutually beneficial. It still is a partnership, but you're winning only 1% of the small cake, right? And that's the argument that China brings. So I think it's important for African countries when they are getting into any sort of partnership with Chinese businesses, with Chinese actors, to think carefully about what they are contributing and what they're getting out of it. In Zambia, for instance, you have many Chinese companies doing mining, right? And one politician was asked, and there's a documentary online, he was asked, how much resources do you have? And he says, to be honest, we have no idea how much of these minerals we have. We can't even estimate. You can't estimate what you have. If you have no idea how much lithium you have, then how are you going to drive a bargain with these companies when they come? They'll simply declare less than they are getting, right? And the fact that most of the processing, most African countries still export primary commodities means that you are exporting the ore and it is not being processed in your country. So what is simply declared is the lithium ore that we have exported to China and it is processed in China. There are many other minerals in the ore, which the African governments are not aware of. So I get disappointed with our African governments because it seems like they just sabotage themselves by simply not investing in knowing what they actually have. And that creates the dependence, right? One exercise that we normally do in some of the classes on China-Africa relations is to look at what African countries were exporting to China and importing from China in, let's say, 2000, and what they're exporting and importing from China in the year 2024. You will be surprised there has been no change across the African continent. And they're exporting primary commodities and importing synthetic hair, suits, many different things, right? And to look at this exchange and to say, is this an equal exchange? Is China any different? I say China is not any different from the way that African countries were trading with Western countries. The difference is that now it is China, but the mode of engagement, the mode of trade, the mode of exchange is simply the same. African countries, primary commodities, China exporting manufactured finished products. And African governments seem to be very comfortable with that arrangement, and that creates that dependence. And it will be very interesting to see what is going to happen when the tariffs become effective on countries like Ethiopia that were exporting manufactured products to Europe, to the US, but from Chinese industrial zones, right? What's going to happen? Right? What you see is that when it is no longer profitable for these Chinese companies to be in Ethiopia, they will move to a third country, and Ethiopia will be left exactly where it was before the Chinese businesses came. So I think African countries need to develop their capacity to negotiate with China and their capacity to know what they actually have and negotiate as a bloc. I think that will help. Yara's question or comment is, from your perspective, what are the long-term social, economic, cultural consequences of community displacement caused by Chinese large-scale Chinese development projects in Africa? And to what extent can this be seen as a new form of neocolonialism? If we're talking about neocolonialism from this perspective, from the capital that is coming, when capital is coming from Europe, when it is coming from the UK, when it is coming from China, the nature of this capital is still the same. They want the maximum profit that they can get at the least cost. Okay, so is this the way that China is operating in Africa? Yes. Chinese capital is no different to US capital or even capital from the UK. It operates on the same way. What can change is when African countries are able to put conditions and say, and this is what China did and helped you to develop, is to say, if you want to invest in Africa, if you want to bring your capital to our country, we will only allow you to set up industry or whatever it is in a joint venture with our own companies so that you're able to transfer skills. And we need to have a skills audit of the skills that we want, the technology that we want from these Chinese companies, and put demands and say, unless you are transferring these skills, this technology, these things, we are okay with not having your capital. We wait for someone else with the capital. African countries, some of them are in a position to do that. Look at lithium. Zimbabwe has the 5th largest deposits of lithium, right? It is in a good position to be able to say, we are not going to allow this lithium to be mined by a Chinese company on its own. It has to be a joint venture. It has to be processed in Zimbabwe and finished products sent out. But it is not doing that because the leaders are corrupt, because they want easy money, they want all these. And because of all those things, we're not willing to do the hard work. We continue to try over the same things. Dependence, weak positions, we're getting nothing out of this thing. So I guess the position of African countries hasn't changed from what it was in the 1960s when African countries got, in the 1950s when African countries got independence. We are largely operating on the same principles, the same ideas, the same ways of doing things. What is simply changing are different partners. It was the Americans, the British, the French. Now it is African, it is China, right? It will be Turkish, it will be anyone else. But as long as African countries do not change their approach, do not change the way that they engage these external actors, we will continue to be in the same position that we were in. And all these other countries will develop, and African countries will remain as weak as they have always been, and even weaker, I think. Yeah, so I think I have responded to all the questions in the chat, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you very much, Orbit, for that insightful talk and for making time on your very busy schedule to share your work with us. Yeah, and I mean spending time and lasting up to the end. I know there are quite a lot of other questions, but I think because of time, I think we'll take what we have covered so far today. And thanks a lot, everyone who has attended the session today. We really appreciate that. And for staying up to the end. We've lost a few because of other commitments, but we really totally appreciate. And Prof. Orbit, we will always call up on you and invite you again in the future. We do run these on a weekly basis, and we really appreciate everyone who has attended, and we invite you for future seminars as well. So thank you very much, Orbit. I really appreciate.
Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your questions,
Thank
for your
you.
insights. I've put my email address in the chat. If you have any questions, you want to engage on this a little bit more, please feel free to send me an email. I'll be happy to respond. But otherwise, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Looking forward to reading the book. And thank you, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day, and hoping to see you again next week on another interesting presentation.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much for attending. We really appreciate that. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hoping to see you again next week.